This hour. Your calls are welcome there as well. And we've got Kane on the line in Tampa, Florida, watching on YouTube. Kane, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, I just wanted to know, how can we know with certainty that the Gospels were actually written by Luke, John, Mark, and Matthew? I've been reading up on this a little bit, and a lot of the sources have been saying that the Gospels were written anonymously, and that the only reason we know who wrote them is because of the church fathers. You have any insight on this?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is we don't need to know for certain who wrote them. What we need to know is that they're divinely inspired. And the church teaches that they're divinely inspired, and we have reason to believe that. Like I said, I've got this whole course on evidence for Christ and why Christianity is true. But as long as you realize they're divinely inspired, it's a historical matter rather than a matter of faith of how specifically they were composed, when specifically they were composed, and by whom they were specifically composed. Having said that, I think we've got really good evidence that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's one little wrinkle in that, but I'll give you a quick sketch. There, in the 20th century, there was a German scholar. He wasn't a Catholic, but his name was Martin Hengel, and he pointed out that the titles on the Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, and the Gospel according to John, are the only titles that these documents ever received. We do not have any records of anyone calling them by any other names, such as, for example, calling Matthew the Gospel to the Jewish people, or the Gospel of Life, or the Gospel of Jesus of Nazareth. We don't have any alternative titles. And what that tells us is that these titles are extremely early, because if the Gospels had circulated for any period of time without titles, then people would have made up other designations for them. Because as soon as, if you're in a church, as soon as your church has more than one gospel, that is going to be read in the liturgy, you need to tell people which gospel you're reading from. And so you need a name for it. And if the gospels had been read in churches for any period of time without the current titles on them, we should see title variations, and we don't. They are always called by these names. And we can document these names going back to the 2nd century. What that tells us is these names were already in place by the end of the 1st century. And as soon as the second gospel was written, you needed to have a way to distinguish it from the other gospels. And so as soon as the second gospel was written, that could have been Luke or it could have been Matthew. The first was probably Mark. But as soon as that second gospel was written, you needed names for these. And since the gospels were all written in the 1st century, that tells us that these names became attached to the Gospels in the 1st century. Now, Psychelet, in the 1st century, did people know who wrote the Gospels?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, of course they did. It's not like they wrote them and then threw them into a church in the dead of night with no witnesses. If you're the author of a gospel, you're going to present it to your church. You're going to mail copies to other churches. And so people would have known who the authors were. And that gives us evidence for the earliness of these titles back when the audience knew who had written the Gospels. There's some confirming evidence as well, because if these titles were made up, then in order to give them authority, in order to give the Gospels authority, you'd want to attribute them to authoritative people like Peter or Andrew or James or people like that. Well, okay, Mark and Luke aren't even apostles. They're not eyewitnesses. And so they're barely mentioned in the New Testament. And so you would not make up the names Mark and Luke if you were trying to give these gospels authority. And that's a really good sign that these names are authoritative, that they're accurate, that Mark and Luke really did write Mark and Luke. What about Matthew? Well, in Matthew's case, Matthew is actually, he's famous today because of the gospel, but at the time he was a mid-tier apostle. When you look at the lists of the apostles in the New Testament, they are structured in 3 groups of 4. And Matthew is not one of the top apostles. He's always in the middle group. So he's also someone that at the time, he wasn't especially famous, and you'd be unlikely to make up his name. You'd also be unlikely to make up his name because his is the gospel most clearly aimed at an audience of Jewish Christians, and yet Matthew was a tax collector, and tax collectors were hated by Jews. So if you're going to make up anybody's name and put it on a gospel, it wouldn't be the tax collector. So that's another sign that Matthew is behind Matthew's gospel. When it comes to John, that's the one wrinkle that I'd mentioned. I think we've got good evidence it was written by someone named John. The question is it John the Apostle, or is it another figure who's been called by some in the early church John the Presbyter, or John the Elder, or by some people today, John of Jerusalem? Because internally it looks like this gospel was written by a member of the Jerusalem aristocracy who was an eyewitness of Jesus's ministry. Even there, though, he's not anonymous. The audience clearly knows who he is, because at the end of John's gospel, he debunks a rumor about himself. There was a rumor that the author of the gospel would never die. And he goes out of his way to say, but Jesus didn't say I would never die. Jesus just said, what if I remained alive until he comes back? So it's clear the audience knew who that rumor was about and that he's debunking it. That's the only reason he would mention this, is because the audience knew about the rumor about him and he wants to set that rumor aside. So I think we've got really good evidence that Matthew was written by the Apostle Matthew, that Mark was written by Mark, the companion of Paul and Peter, that Luke was written by Luke, the companion of Paul, and that John was written by John. There's just a question of, is it John the Apostle or John the Elder?
Thank you very, very much for the call and for the question. It's open forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and we are just past the halfway mark of our quarterly pledge